What if I told you a 6 week sweet spot training block followed by 6 weeks of polarized training could nearly double your FTP gains? Like instead of 3%, you'd improve 6%. That's because the secret to unlocking more fitness, longer endurance, higher FTPs, it isn't one or the other, but it's a combination of both training methodologies. In this video, you'll learn why using sweet spot and polarized training together works and how to implement them in your training. Welcome back to another training tip. I'm Coach Frank Overton. Some call me the Big Cat. And cyclists who train this way for just 12 weeks will see a greater increase in their power output, their FTP, their endurance, their durability, time to exhaustion than they ever thought possible with either method alone. Now, a little background. The traditional method of training for endurance cycling was to build your base in the winter and then race your way to fitness at the start of the season. Then, in 2005, I introduced sweet spot training, which was also around the time power-based interval training was rising. And then along came Dr. Steven Seiler's paper on polarized training. And the science says that both methodologies works. Pyramidal works, polarized work, and it makes perfect sense, except that you should not do polarized training year-round, nor should you do sweet spot training year-round. And if you do, you're leaving watts on the table with a sweet spot approach, and then you're leaving endurance on the table with a polarized approach. Coaches have known this empirically for years, which is why we've traditionally prescribed building a strong base, followed by race-specific interval training. What I introduced in 2005 was that sweet spot just happened to be a superior method to building a strong base than the old school methodology of piles of miles and LSD, long slow distance, or the modern day Zone 2 glorified on the internet. But the problem is, ain't nobody got time for that, and thus the reason why sweet spot is better than Zone 2 for amateur, time crunched, masters athletes. When power-based interval training came along, it became more prevalent in the rise of the coaching industry in the 2000s. We found that incredibly effective too. And the coaches in the know who had their athletes on power meters were seeing firsthand in the data that the athletes who were fresh were making more power output and they achieved greater physiological adaptations. The phrase "go hard on your hard days and easy on your easy days," it was well known in the 1980s and 1990s, with roots back to Arthur Lydiard, the legendary New Zealand running coach who emphasized its importance. And Seiler proved that the polarized distribution model worked, and thus the debate began: which is better, sweet spot or polarized? And note that sweet spot technically falls into what the science describes as a pyramidal training approach. But meanwhile, experienced coaches kept prescribing base in the winter, intervals as the season got closer with using both methodologies. And in 2019 on the Fast Cat podcast, we popularized the term switching from base to race and describing when to shift from following a sweet spot style of training and switching to a more polarized approach. However, this concept is rooted in classic periodization theory developed by Soviet and Eastern Bloc sports scientists like Tudor Bumpa in the 1970s and 80s. And then, in 2023, came the Codella et al. Study from the University of Milan. And this research group compared the effects of polarized and pyramidal training models. And their work built upon Seiler's polarized concept by investigating the combinations of how these approaches might unlock even greater gains. And they made two key findings. Number one, that pyramidal training was shown to enhance endurance performance to a similar or greater extent than polarized training alone. And that number two, even more important, pyramidal training with polarized elements may provide a more comprehensive stimulus for adaptation. And essentially, this hybrid approach captures the best of using both methodologies. Now, the way they conducted this group is, this will make sense after I explain it. So they had 4 experimental groups that train over 16 weeks. Group number 1 trained pyramidal for 16 weeks. Group number 2 trained polarized for 16 weeks. Group number 3 did pyramidal training for 8 weeks, followed by polarized training for 8 weeks. And then group 4 did polarized training for 8 weeks, followed by pyramidal training for 8 weeks. All 4 groups experienced improvements in endurance performance metrics. However, it was group number 3 that improved the most. The group that did pyramidal for 8 weeks followed by Polarized for 8 weeks. That group experienced the most significant improvements, and they were measuring relative VO2 peak velocity at 2 and 4 millimole of blood lactate concentration, as well as 5-kilometer running time trial performance. Now, these results are starting to suggest that pyramidal training followed by polarized training to enhance high-intensity performance is more effective than adhering to a single distribution model throughout the training cycle, which is how we've been prescribing training for 20 years. Now the science has finally caught up to the coaches. But this is also corroborated by Dr. Jereon Swart, head of performance at UAE's World Tour team, none other than Tadej Pogacar, who says pyramidal training intensity distribution is seemingly the most optimal for the kinds of racing done in the World Tour. You can check that out at minute 5:49 into the January 2025 GCN video. And I think it's also important to note with regards to the Codella study, as of now, there's not a similar published study on cyclists. However, the principles observed in running populations may offer useful considerations for training strategies in cycling through direct evidence in cyclists, though direct evidence in cyclists is currently lacking, except from us coaches that have been preaching this for 2 decades, and except for Dr. Jereon Swart, who is having the Tadej Pogacar train this way. And maybe there's a young PhD student watching out there searching for a thesis, know a project. So what does this look like in a training plan? How do you implement this if you're on board? So imagine this. You start with 6 weeks of focused sweet spot training. You're going to build a strong, robust aerobic engine. You're going to stack sweet spot workouts. You're going to do both structured and time and zone unstructured workouts. And that's going to form the backbone of your aerobic engine for FTP gains, durability, time to exhaustion. And then after you've raised your level and built up that aerobic foundation, you're going to shift gears. You're going to do the next 6 weeks at pure polarized training. No more sweet spot, high intensity intervals only. You're going to take a lot of rest days, and then you're going to ride in zone 2. And what's going to happen physiologically, your VO2 is going to go up, and you're going to supercharge your anaerobic capacity. And then that combined with the aerobic gains you made from the sweet spot training, it's just going to just amplify and accentuate your training even more. Your FTP is going to go up. Your durability is going to lengthen, as well as your time to exhaustion. So that's 12 weeks total. That's just 3 months. And you'll go way beyond your old FTP plateau or ceiling. And so what that looks like is you'll concentrate on 6 weeks of sweet spot. You're going to do 2 to 3 sweet spot workouts per week in 2 forms. You're going to do, number one is shorter midweek structured intervals between 84 and 97% of your FTP. And then on the weekends, you're going to do longer unstructured rides focusing on time in the sweet spot zone. You can do that for 6 weeks, and then you're going to switch from base to race, and you're going to concentrate on 6 weeks of full gas VO2 and anaerobic intervals with shorter structured midweek intervals between 105, 120%, and then your anaerobic work is done at 120% plus. Then you're also going to use high intensity group rides for that organic intensity. You're going to take 2 to 3 rest days per week, and you're going to do 1 to 2 longer strict zone 2 rides on the weekend. That's 12 weeks. If you're really serious, I would encourage you to dedicate 24 weeks. Start with 16 weeks of sweet spot. Really get that level up higher than you ever had before. I'm talking 70s, 80s, 90s. And then you switch from base to race, and then you do 6 weeks of interval training. And so if you're serious about really pushing up your FTP, adopt this 24-week sweet spot and then polarized training approach. All right. That's all we have for today. Thanks so much for watching. Let me know in the comments if you have any observations, you've seen different results, you have any questions about future topics you would like to learn about. And you know what to do. Work hard, ride fast, have fun, and as always, FTF.